I'm going to talk about the impact of human activities on the planetary scale. And this is there is a thought experiment here that so far in the aftermath of the industrial civilization, we have grown to think like individual. The question is, given the impact of human activities on the planet, at the planetary scale, can we start to think like a planet? And this grows from the realization that since the last 250, 300 years, the impact of human activities on biodiversity loss has grown out of proportions. The biodiversity is being lost more than 1,000 times above the background biodiversity rates that we have observed. So if you look at it from a dynamic perspective, you can imagine where we are headed in the next 50 to 100 years, and what would be the consequences of that if we do not change our present development trajectory. Secondly, in terms of climate change, where are we headed? We had pre-industrial about 260 to 270 parts per million CO2 emission concentration. And now, at this point, we have about 389, 390 parts per million. And if you look at the future trajectory, we're headed towards about 750 to 850 parts per million by the end of this century if we do not change our course of actions and our behaviors. Similarly, in terms of the agricultural impact on the biogeochemical cycles of, like, say, phosphorus and nitrogen, we've already crossed so-called safe planetary boundaries. And this was a study done by Rockström et al. Out of Resilience Alliance Group from Sweden. And they hypothesized about certain safe boundaries that exist for each one of those impacts, which are shown as the green and on a different indicator. So for example, for the climate change, it's 350 parts per million. Now, of course, you can question what would be that critical transition, whether it's going to be 350 parts per million, whether it's going to be 2 degrees centigrade, whether it's going to be 550 parts per million by the end of this century that we need to stop at. That's something that a policy negotiation process is open to when we, for example, you track the UN negotiations about where should be the policy goal, whether it should be 550 parts per million or 2 centigrades. But many people are already saying that if we want to play it safe, if we do not want the planetary system to transition into some new state, some regime shift, or some tipping point after which it will be very, very difficult for us to revert back, we need to think about changing the policy and the governance structure at the planetary scale. We need to think like a planet if we want to solve that problem. So when you study what is the governance structure, what are the policies that are in place to deal with these kind of planetary scale problems, we see only chaos. There is no international government. The only weak regime of UN system has failed to deliver on many of these planetary scale problems. So the question is, can we, or could we, or do we need to change this governance structure? There is one good news with respect to the chlorofluorocarbons and the atmospheric ozone, that after the Montreal Agreement of 1989, all the nation states were able to collaboratively agree on bringing down from the business as usual to where we are now, where if you look at the most bottom line, we have really brought it down, at least in agreement, that we would not have these chlorofluorocarbons destroy the stratospheric ozone, which would have really played havoc with some of the planetary shield in terms of some of the radiation. But when we look at the greenhouse gas emissions, especially on this, you can see like the actual observed fossil fuel emissions in petagrams of carbon per year or billion tons of carbon per year are plotted against a time. You would see that we are on the higher edge, on the 90th percentile top edge of the uncertainty interval that was projected by IPCC. It means that we are on a fossil fuel intensive path of this greenhouse gas emissions. That means that we're going to be we're looking at about 750 to 850 parts per million under the business as usual trajectory by the end of this century. And that would translate into something like this, this comes from about 5 different combined global circulation models, the bottom picture. We're looking at about, on average, 5 to 6 degrees centigrade rise at the planetary scale, but the polar regions, we're looking at about 7 to 8 degrees, the purple regions that you're looking at, and the Arctic is already melting. It's happening. There are some controversies about the impacts on the precipitation patterns, on the storm systems, but about the temperature, the scientific models have really established clear-cut consensus that we are headed towards 5 to 6 degrees by the end of this century. And why should we stop at the end of this century? Why not to think about what would happen if you're thinking about big scale? Why not what's going to happen in 22nd century? What's going to happen in the 23rd century? Why should we stop the human civilization at 22nd century? So the question here is that if you're thinking like a planet, you have to think like at a much larger scale. And we still have a chance. We did not do anything in the last 20 years. So now we are committed to by about 20 years because of these lag effects in this planetary system. The carbon dioxide emissions that have been emitted in the last 250 years, their residency time is about 1,000 years. Some of these emissions stay for much longer time. So what are we looking at right now in terms of is that we are already committed to about 1 to 1.5 degrees in the next 20 years, even if we start taking mitigation actions today. So the question is, do we want to do anything to avoid this kind of catastrophic scenario and its other impacts on, it's not just going to be having an impact on the human civilization per se, it's also going to have an impact on the other ecological systems or biodiversity as well. So there are some complexities in terms of our impacts on the planetary scale that we still cannot foresee. So if you look at who is responsible for this, I'm just showing it here, just one, it's basically US emits about 20% of the greenhouse gas emissions. If you put US and China and EU taken together, that's about 50%. And then there are about 20 countries that are producing about 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions. That proportion has not changed much. In the past, these were the US and the EU countries which did that. Now, if you look at the next 50 years, it's going to be China and India and Brazil, where the development activities are happening. So the question is, who is responsible? And there are it's very complex picture because it's not just one sector. As in the case of chlorofluorocarbons, we just had the refrigeration system and some of these other systems that were like a small group of industries which were responsible. In the case of greenhouse gas emissions, we're looking at energy systems, we're looking at transportation, we're looking at agriculture, we're looking at other kinds of green buildings, buildings that could be converted to green buildings to avoid that. So there is a complexity of sources from different countries, which is making it difficult to visualize some of the mitigation scenarios. One of the problems is that what would happen if the developing countries, if they grow as the same fossil fuel path that the US and EU took in the last 250 years. The fossil fuel path is that business as usual path, and on the x-axis you have here GDP per capita, on the y-axis is the CO2 tons per capita. So typically the richer countries have grown, but they have grown with the externality effect of CO2 emissions. So you can increase your income from $10,000 per capita to $30,000, $35,000, but at the expense of also increasing your CO2 emissions per capita to 30 to 40 to 50 tons. The question is, can the developing countries, are they also going to follow the same path in the 21st century, or are they going to be able to leapfrog and have some kind of sustainable, increase their income at the same time not having an impact on the carbon or other kinds of ecological footprint. So this is another way to look at it, is that there is this huge diversity in terms of, there is a bipolarity at the global scale, is that on the x-axis we have Human Development Index, which is typically a good measure in addition to GDP per capita to track what is development. This is a weighted measure of education and health and GDP. And then on the y-axis we have the ecological footprint. And you would see that none of these 100 plus countries that are tracked there on these two axes, we see them falling in any way on the sustainable development quadrant, which would be higher Human Development Index, like that's according to the UN definition 0.8, as well as their ecological footprint being below 2 hectares per person. And this is just 2003, and if we try to project that to 2050 with 9 billion people, or by 2100, we are looking at some very perverse scenarios here. So, and if you look at a lot of the African countries which are shown in the brown color here, they are still on very, very low human development index, anywhere from 0.3 to 0.5, 0.6. So naturally, they're going to develop. The question is whether they will leapfrog and maintain their, develop with lower ecological footprint, and carbon footprint is part of that ecological footprint equation, or they will follow the same path that the fossil fuel intensive economies have done in the last 200 years with higher ecological footprint, but also very high human development index, which is shown like the North American as well as European countries you would see on this right side of the equation. So the question here is that we have this bipolar problem. One is that we need to bring these high impact, like the higher ecological footprint countries of the European and EU, as well as the North American countries. We need to bring their ecological footprint to somehow towards the sustainable quadrant in the next 50 to 60 years, as well as we need to make sure that the African and the Asian countries that are developing, they do not have higher ecological footprint in the next 50 to 100 years. That's the only way we can avoid this catastrophic scenario at the planetary scale that we're looking at. But what kind of institutional structures do we have? Do we have institutional structures to do that? So after my research in the last 4 or 5 years with the UN system and some of these other large agencies that we've been looking into, what we have found is that essentially right now this is a so-called like the business as usual scenario, which was established at the end of the Second World War when these planetary scale problems were more or less non-existent, or they were existent but they were not as much perceived as they have been perceived in the last 30, 40 years. So there is this weak Bretton Woods system where you have essentially UN Security Council that represents the winners of the Second World War, who have the veto powers to make any decision. Then the General Assembly can only make recommendations about what should be done, but they do not have any power about doing anything on these environmental issues. Then you have these contradictory institutions like World Trade Organization that has emerged that is promoting free trade. Free trade, when you promote free trade, that is actually the part of the globalization, the fossil fuel intensive path that is being promoted under that institutional mechanism. On the other hand, there are these UN agencies like UN RED program or UN Environmental Program, which have very small budgets. They are trying to think about or talk about climate change, but nobody is listening to them. And it's essentially, those of you who track, probably Copenhagen was the most famous 2009 negotiation process where everybody was optimistic. There was a hype that maybe President Obama would make some difference, but nothing happened because Americans are one of the major players in the system, and so are the Chinese. Many commentators have said that the failure of Copenhagen was actually so-called US-China suicide pact, essentially because so long as US and China are not on the table in terms of solving this puzzle, it will be very difficult for other countries to agree on this issue. Now, how would you bring these powerful countries to agree on some kind of arrangement that requires, that could have huge adverse impacts on people's lifestyles, and as well as your ideology? So there are some alternate scenarios that have been proposed that we are working on with some of the international collaborators in this project. One of them is to modify the existing UN system and restructure the UN Security Council, and the other one is to replace the UN system with a world government where we need to have a democratically elected parliament, more like a bicameral system of Senate as well as lower house, which will lead to some kind of democratic global governance that could address such planetary scale issues, and so we could start thinking like a planet. So that's my talk, and there is more discussion on this coming out in the February 2013 book. Thank you.